In 1462, the most powerful army on earth marched to destroy a tiny country. When they arrived, they turned around and left, not because they lost the battle, because of the 20,000 bodies waiting for them. The horror was the mind that arranged them. The year is 1442. The Ottoman Empire does not negotiate, it consumes. It has digested the Byzantine Empire, crushed Balkan kingdoms that stood for centuries, and is now pressing northward through a narrow strip of contested territory wedged between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River. That territory is called Wallachia. Its ruler, Vlad II, known as Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Dragon, holds a throne that exists only because he is useful to someone larger than himself. Vlad the Dragon is a member of the Order of the Dragon, a Christian military fraternity pledged to resist Ottoman expansion. But when Sultan Mehmed II arrives with terms rather than an army, the dragon makes a calculation that redraws his family's future. Keep the throne, keep the principality. In exchange, hand over 2 sons as permanent hostages. Vlad III, age 11, Radu, age 7, surrendered as collateral, living proof of their father's continuing cooperation. Think carefully about that transaction. A father who chose his crown over his children, not to save his people, to save his seat. That choice set in motion everything that follows. The boys were installed at the Ottoman court at Edirne and later at Igriguis. They were not placed in dungeons. They were given robes, tutors, military instruction, and access to palace life. They trained in horsemanship. They studied Arabic, Turkish, and philosophy. On paper, the arrangement looked like privilege, but what was actually happening inside those palace walls would produce something the Ottomans had no plan for and could not stop once it was set in motion. Radu, the younger of the two, adapted. He was pliable in the way that young children are when completely surrounded by a new world. He grew close to Mehmed, the Sultan's son. History would later name him Radu the Handsome. By all accounts, he thrived, becoming, in a real sense, more Ottoman than Wallachian. Vlad refused to become anything his captors intended. He resisted. He argued. He was physically punished on multiple occasions according to court records, the exact nature of the punishments obscured by the careful language of diplomatic documentation. What those records make unmistakably clear is the pattern: repeated defiance, repeatedly corrected. For 6 years, between the ages of 11 and 17, Vlad observed the mechanics of empire from the inside. He watched how fear was deployed as governance. He studied how a single visible execution could suppress dissent across an entire province. He catalogued how terror, applied with precision rather than randomness, achieved outcomes that standing armies could not. He was learning. He was cataloguing. He was building something. Was he a broken boy or a student taking notes? The answer, as his life would demonstrate, is that the two were the same thing. In 1448, Vlad was released. Age 17. He crossed back into Wallachia to find it in pieces. His father had been killed, murdered by Wallachian boyars, the noble class, in concert with Hungarian political interests. His older brother Mircea had suffered something worse than death, buried alive with his eyes removed first. The men responsible had already switched allegiances and installed a new ruler without interruption. Vlad had nothing. No crown, no army, no patron, no allies. He was a teenager carrying 6 years of captivity, a demolished family, and a country that had moved on without him. Most men in that position become footnotes. Vlad began a ledger. Every name, every face, every debt. He intended to collect. He spent the next 6 years in exile, moving through Moldavia under Ottoman protection, then shifting to the Hungarian court of John Hunyadi, whose interest in Wallachia made Vlad a strategically useful instrument. He trained. He studied military organization and political mechanics. He waited with the patience of someone who has learned that timing determines everything. In 1456, with Hungarian support and his own accumulated leverage, Vlad III seized the Wallachian throne. He was 25 years old. The ledger was open. The coronation celebration of 1456 is one of the most precisely documented events in medieval Wallachian history, not because of the food or the ceremony or the political speeches, because of the one question Vlad asked in the middle of dinner. He had invited every boyar family in Wallachia, all of them, the men who had murdered his father, the men who had buried his brother alive, the men who had spent their careers surviving every prince who sat on this throne and intended to survive him too. They arrived dressed in their finest, assuming the young prince required their cooperation. Vlad let them eat. He let them drink. He let them relax. Then he stood and asked, "How many princes of Wallachia have you personally lived through?" The older boyars answered with something close to pride. 7, 10. One elderly nobleman claimed 12. They were signaling their durability, their indispensability. They were communicating in the coded language of medieval courts. "We outlast everyone. We will outlast you." Vlad nodded. Then he gave a signal. The exits, which had been quietly secured before a single guest arrived, sealed. Every boyar who had answered the question was arrested where he sat. Here is the detail that reveals the architecture of his thinking most clearly. He did not execute them immediately. He sorted them. The eldest boyars, those he held most directly accountable for his family's destruction, were taken outside the palace walls that same evening and impaled. The stakes were positioned with attention to anatomy. Death was not designed to be fast. The younger, physically capable boyars and their households received a different allocation. Stripped to their basic clothing and handed crude tools, they were marched 50 miles north to the crumbling ruins of Ponari Fortress, perched above the Aga River Gorge. There they were given a single instruction: rebuild it. With their hands, with their bodies, or die where they stood. They worked through spring and into summer. Those who stopped were killed. Those who collapsed died on the site. The survivors built what is now called Vlad's Castle, which still stands above the river gorge today, a monument to the labor of men who were never intended to survive its completion. He had not merely destroyed his enemies, he had converted their suffering into permanent infrastructure. That distinction tells you everything about how this man thought. What does it reveal when a ruler treats vengeance as a construction project? It means he is not operating on emotion. He is operating on architecture. Vlad understood something that most rulers of his period did not. Raw fear fades when its source is absent. He needed something more structural. A noble class that owed its every privilege to him, that understood, not intellectually but viscerally, in their bodies, exactly what the consequences of disloyalty were. He built that class from nothing. He replaced the old boyars with men who had no history before his favor, and no future without it. The effects rippled outward. Within a few years, Wallachia had undergone a transformation that contemporary accounts describe in striking terms. A story, possibly exaggerated in the retelling, but persistent across multiple independent sources, describes Vlad placing a golden cup at the central fountain of Targovi and leaving it there. No one took it, for years. Not because the population was honest, because the alternative was something they had seen performed in public squares and understood concretely. In 1459, Sultan Mehmed II, who had been growing up alongside Vlad inside the Ottoman palace during those years of captivity, and was now Sultan following his father's death, dispatched a formal diplomatic mission to Wallachia. The demands were the standard ones: resume tribute, appear personally in Constantinople, reaffirm subordination. The delegation arrived with the full confidence of people representing the most powerful ruler on earth. They had no reason to expect anything unusual. This was routine imperial maintenance. They walked into something they had no category for. During the formal audience, the envoys declined to remove their turbans, a legitimate Ottoman court custom in which removing the turban carried connotations of submission. Vlad asked them to explain the tradition. They did, probably relieved that he seemed willing to understand rather than simply take offense. Vlad listened. He nodded thoughtfully. Then he said he admired that kind of devotion. He ordered his guards to nail the turbans to their skulls using iron spikes. The men survived. That was the point. A dead envoy sends one message and arrives at its destination silent. A living envoy, permanently disfigured, in continuous agony, walking the length of the Balkans back toward Constantinople, that delivers something else entirely. These men were not messengers. They were a sentence. When Mehmed received them back, men he had sent in professional good faith, returning in a state that no language in his court had been prepared to describe, the strategic calculation became immediate. The boy from the Edirne palace, the defiant one who had taken punishment without bending, was gone. What had replaced him had taken every Ottoman lesson about the governance of fear and compressed it into a form even the Ottoman court had not designed. War was no longer a future possibility. It had already begun. Vlad had simply fired the first shot without a weapon. Now we need to address the method directly. because the version most people carry is not accurate, and the accurate version is considerably more disturbing. Popular imagination pictures impalement as fast and crude. A spike, a body, a quick end. This is not what the historical record describes. Ottoman, Byzantine, Saxon, and Wallachian sources all corroborate a consistent procedural account. The stake was carved from hardwood, the point rounded and oiled. The victim was placed horizontally. The stake entered the body at a calculated angle, one specifically designed to advance through the internal cavity while avoiding the organs and major blood vessels that would cause rapid death. The victim was then raised vertical. Gravity completed what the placement had established. The process took hours. Sometimes it extended across 2 or 3 full days. In documented cases, the stake eventually emerged through the chest or shoulder. Throughout, the victim remained alive, sometimes conscious. Why would anyone engineer death to take that long? Because Vlad was not in the business of individual executions. He was managing the psychology of entire populations, and he understood something that research in trauma psychology now confirms with precision: prolonged, witnessed suffering produces a qualitatively different fear response than swift death. A battlefield killing is a tragedy with a defined endpoint. A man dying over 3 days outside the city gate is an event that permanently restructures every mind that passes by. It cannot be unfiled. It cannot be forgotten. It operates on the viewer even years later. Vlad positioned bodies with the care of a set designer. Major roads, public squares, city entrances. He varied the heights by rank, lower stakes for ordinary people, taller for nobility, the tallest reserved for commanding officers, creating a grotesque but legible hierarchy that reinforced a single message: everyone has a place in my system, and the system extends in every direction. In several documented accounts, entire fields were arranged in geometric configurations, rings, grids, patterns that formed recognizable structures from elevated ground. This was not chaos, this was composition. A German pamphlet from 1462, compiled from testimony by Saxon merchants who had operated in Wallachia, describes Vlad dining in the open air amid rows of impaled figures. Whether this precise scene occurred exactly as described is debated by historians. What is not debated is the message the image carries. I occupy a position your horror cannot touch. Your reaction to this is scenery. Those pamphlets, printed on early Gutenberg-era presses illustrated with crude woodcuts, spread across Central Europe with a velocity no previous horror story had achieved. They became among the earliest examples of mass-produced fear content in recorded history. In a real sense, Vlad's reputation went viral before the concept existed. By spring of 1462, Mehmed II was finished with patience. Vlad had refused tribute payments for years. He had conducted cross-border raids deep into Ottoman territory, and in the letter to the Hungarian king that still survives in archives today, Vlad himself documented killing approximately 23,840 people in a single campaign. Categorized by demographic, he maintained records of his own violence the way a merchant tracks inventory. Mehmed assembled between 60 and 90,000 soldiers in response. These were not levies or conscripts. These were the veterans of Constantinople, the finest military force operating anywhere on earth. Against them, Vlad could field perhaps 20 to 30,000 men, the majority of whom were farmers given weapons. What do you do when the most lethal army on the planet is pointed directly at you with orders to erase your country from the map? You refuse to let them fight the war they came to fight. As the Ottoman columns entered Wallachia, they found a country that had been surgically emptied. Villages abandoned, granaries reduced to ash, wells contaminated or deliberately blocked, livestock driven into mountain passes too narrow for large formations. Every bridge, every ford, every supply depot along every expected route had been neutralized in advance. The army advanced into a vacuum of its own making, carrying supplies that diminished with every mile and could not be replaced from the landscape. Then the nights began. Vlad had trained rapid strike units, groups of 50 to 100, selected for endurance and terrain knowledge, to descend on Ottoman camps after midnight and withdraw before the camp could organize a response. They used captured Ottoman uniforms in some operations to generate close-range confusion. They targeted horses, supply wagons, and the sentries whose job was to make sleep possible. This was not warfare aimed at casualties. It was warfare aimed at the destruction of psychological stability, the systematic removal of the assumption that rest was safe. On the night of June 17, 1462, Vlad's intelligence, gathered from captured soldiers, confirmed that Mehmed himself was camped near Targovich with his janissaries, his elite personal guard. Vlad led 10,000 men into a direct infiltration of the camp. The operation was not a charge. It was a penetration, multiple smaller columns entering from different vectors simultaneously, setting fires, eliminating the outer perimeter, funneling everything toward the Sultan's pavilion with a single objective: reach Mehmed. How close they came is a matter of ongoing historical dispute. Close enough that the Janissaries were compelled to physically encircle their Sultan's tent. Close enough that Ottoman historians, who consistently minimized the accomplishments of their opponents, recorded the moment as one of genuine crisis. By dawn, Vlad withdrew into the surrounding terrain. His force disappeared the way it had arrived, without formation, without trace. He had not killed the Sultan. He had demonstrated to 90,000 professional soldiers that their commander could be reached in his own bed by a fraction of their number, without detection, until it was almost too late. That knowledge, now embedded in every mind in the camp, was a form of damage that no formation could repair. The army marched on toward Tajervi. There are moments in the historical record where language reaches its own limits, where accounts from multiple independent sources attempt to describe the same thing and all arrive at the same inadequacy. What Mehmed's army encountered outside the Wallachian capital in late June 1462 is one of those moments. The smell arrived first. It preceded the visual by half a mile. A thick, sweet, fermented weight in the summer air that embedded itself in clothing and could not be cleared by breathing through the mouth. The soldiers in the advance columns had no frame of reference for its scale. Then the shapes materialized of the heat shimmer on the plain. Stakes, dozens, then hundreds, then past any meaningful counting. The Byzantine historian Laonikos Chalkokondyles, who gathered eyewitness testimony from survivors, describes an installation extending approximately 2 miles in length and half a mile in width. Modern historians place the number of bodies at between 15 and 20,000. They have been arranged with deliberate geometric intent, concentric rings, radiating rows, structured patterns legible from elevated terrain like text written in the landscape itself. Some bodies had occupied their stakes for weeks, blackening in the July heat. Others were more recent, and some, confirmed by multiple independent accounts, were still alive, past the ability to produce sound, but present enough to register what was approaching across the plain. At the precise center of the arrangement, on the tallest stake, positioned directly on the Sultan's approach vector, and dressed in the deteriorating remnants of his official uniform, Hamza Pasha, a senior Ottoman commander captured in an earlier engagement and kept alive specifically for this placement. A message with a recipient: it is not possible to deprive of his country a man who does such things. Sultan Mehmed II, upon approaching Targovi, 1462, Mehmed II reined in his horse and went silent. The account preserved by Chalkokondyles records what followed. The Sultan acknowledged that a man capable of devising and executing such a thing in defense of his own territory could not be dislodged from it by conventional means. This was not a compliment. It was a recalibration, the recognition of a system he had not modeled and could not immediately answer. His military position was already deteriorating. Supply lines had exceeded their functional range. Morale had been abraded by weeks of sleep deprivation and invisible enemies. His senior commanders had been advising withdrawal for days. The forest was the final argument. Within days, Mehmed ordered the main force south. He left Radu, Vlad's own younger brother, with a contingent to maintain pressure. The Sultan himself departed with the bulk of the army. The empire that had consumed Constantinople walked into a principality 1/10 its size, brought the full weight of its military capacity, and turned around. Not because it was beaten, because the cost of continuing had been made to feel unbearable. The victory held for roughly 4 months. The thinking that had made Vlad impossible to defeat did not have a switch. He had constructed this particular mind over 20 years, and the mechanisms he had built could not distinguish between an external enemy and an internal problem once the campaign was over. He began impaling Wallachian merchants for suspected price manipulation. He ordered boyars executed on the basis of uncorroborated rumors. He imposed capital punishment on villages for offenses that no contemporary legal system in Europe would have treated as serious infractions. The instrument built to stop an empire became his only available response to every situation that arose, at every scale. What the Ottoman army could not accomplish with 90,000 soldiers, 4 months of domestic collapse accomplished from the inside. His brother Radu, funded by Ottoman gold, presenting himself as the measured and stable alternative, steadily accumulated Wallachian support. The Hungarian political infrastructure that had put Vlad on the throne quietly withdrew as his behavior rendered him a liability to everyone who had invested in him. By November 1462, 4 months after his greatest military achievement, Vlad crossed into Hungarian territory under pressure, his support structures gone. He was detained by Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, the same patron who had backed his throne. The stated reasons were ambiguous: forged correspondence, alleged contacts with the Ottomans. Historians generally read this as he had become politically unmanageable and his sponsors needed him contained. The detention lasted 12 years. Not in harsh conditions, in comfortable house arrest near Visegrad. He married a Hungarian noblewoman. He had children. By every account, he was, in confinement, entirely cooperative and unremarkable. In 1476, political circumstances shifted again. Wallachia had fragmented under a succession of weak rulers. Stephen the Great of Moldavia coordinated a return backed by Hungarian and Moldavian forces. Vlad reclaimed his throne in November 1476. He held it for approximately 2 months. In late December 1476 or early January 1477, the sources disagree on the exact date, which feels somehow appropriate for a man defined by ambiguity. Vlad was killed in combat near Bucharest. The circumstances are genuinely contested. Some accounts suggest his own men struck him down, through treachery or through confusion in close fighting. Others record an Ottoman engagement that overwhelmed his position. The aftermath is not contested. His head was removed, preserved in honey to survive the journey, delivered to Sultan Mehmed II in Constantinople as documentation that Vlad Dracula was dead. He turned fear into a fortress and died inside it. The man who arranged 20,000 bodies into geometric patterns to turn back an empire ended as a trophy delivered to that empire in a jar of honey. His physical remains, according to tradition, were interred at Snagov Monastery on an island in the Ilfov district of Romania. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 1930s, the crypt beneath the marker was empty. No confirmed burial site for Vlad III Dracula has ever been found. The man who built his entire legacy on visibility, on the calculated spectacle of public terror, has no locatable grave. Romania engages with Vlad differently from most of the world. In serious historical and political writing, he appears as a symbol of national resistance, a prince who held an impossible position against overwhelming force, using unconventional means because conventional ones were unavailable. Statues of him stand in Tagovi and Sayuara. His image carries weight that has nothing to do with Dracula mythology. The rest of the world largely knows Vlad through Bram Stoker's 1897 Gothic novel, which borrowed his name and the folkloric valence of his father's title, Dracul, meaning both dragon and devil in Romanian, to construct a fictional vampire with no substantive connection to the historical figure. The fictional count has so thoroughly displaced the actual prince in popular memory that it functions, in an almost perverse way, as a release valve. The supernatural villain is easier to manage than the human one. The monster from mythology is more comfortable than the man who was made, because the man who was made is the disturbing part. He was a child given away by a father who prioritized his crown. He was a prisoner who used his captivity as a curriculum rather than allowing it to simply diminish him. He was a man who came home to a destroyed family and spent 2 decades constructing a response. And when the tools were ready, he used them with a coherence and discipline that suggests not madness, but a very long, very specific, very deliberate kind of preparation. The field outside Tau Davit was not the expression of a broken mind. It was the final examination of a very thorough education. The Ottomans taught Vlad that fear is the most durable political currency available to anyone who lacks conventional resources. They gave him years to study the mechanisms. And when the test arrived, the student applied the lesson at a scale and with a precision that exceeded anything the teachers had designed. What should stay with us is not the suffering. History has no shortage of suffering. What should stay with us is the internal logic, the fact that it was structured, intentional, aimed at a measurable outcome and work. against an opponent 10 times his size, with no strategic depth and no reliable alliances. Vlad held his country and turned back the dominant military power of the 15th century, not through superior force but through a more complete understanding of what fear does to the human mind when it is engineered rather than incidental. That is the history that the vampire myth covers. The question that matters is not whether he was capable of cruelty that requires no investigation. The question is what it reveals about human systems, about what captivity produces when it is used as a school, about what trauma manufactures when it is not discharged but directed, about what happens when a person with nothing left constructs the one weapon available to him out of the exact material his captors used, and about what it means that it was enough. If you stayed to the end of this, you understand something important. Vlad III, Dracula, is not a horror story in the conventional sense. He is a case study in what extreme powerlessness produces when it is given time, intelligence, and an eventual opportunity. The historian fact exists for exactly these cases, the ones that do not simplify cleanly, the ones that textbooks omit because they are too human to reduce to a villain and too disturbing to leave in the middle. If that is the history you want, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We are not finished. Which historical figure do you believe has been most distorted by the way history chose to record them? Tell us below, we read everything.